He stepped onto a $100 million zero-cents yacht in a hoodie and jeans. Within minutes, they laughed, mocked, and humiliated him. But what none of them knew was that he wasn't just another guest. And by the time the truth came out, the entire ship would fall silent in shame. So who was the man they tried to erase? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The golden light of the Mediterranean sun spilled across the harbor, kissing the sides of luxury yachts and reflecting off the polished chrome of stretch limousines. The dock buzzed with activity as one by one sleek cars arrived, each door opening to reveal a celebrity, a billionaire, or a socialite wrapped in silk, sequins, or perfectly pressed tuxedos. Photographers, assistants, and staff fluttered around them like moths drawn to wealth. This was no ordinary cruise. This was the Sovereign Voyage, a 5-day luxury experience aboard a $100 million zero-cent century yacht called the Celestia, billed as the most exclusive sea event of the decade. There were whispers that even the waiting list required a personal recommendation and a 7-figure deposit. The guest list boasted names with entire islands named after them. As the red carpet stretched out across the private dock, guests walked with the air of people who believed the ocean owed them its calm. Among the commotion, a modest yellow cab pulled up and came to an abrupt stop near the edge of the restricted pier. The driver didn't step out. Instead, the back door opened gently, and out stepped a man who didn't belong. At least, not according to the script of the evening. He wore a faded gray hoodie, jeans worn thin at the knees, and an old pair of sneakers with scuffed soles. A canvas backpack hung from one shoulder, and a weathered baseball cap sat low on his brow. There was no entourage. No photographer called his name. No staff rushed forward to greet him. He moved calmly, eyes steady, as though unaffected by the gold-trimmed chaos around him. He passed a Rolls-Royce and a Ferrari, his steps deliberate and unhurried. Several staff members, dressed in crisp uniforms, exchanged looks before one of them whispered to another, "Who let him through?" The check-in desk stood under a silk canopy, staffed by a woman named Rochelle, whose smile had been trained in both warmth and hierarchy. She greeted each guest with polite cheerfulness and calculated charm. But when the man in the hoodie stepped into line, her posture changed slightly. Her smile didn't disappear, but it tightened. Her eyes drifted quickly to the clipboard in front of her, the one marked VIP boarding manifest, and then back to him. He reached the desk and spoke in a calm voice. Keanu Reeves. The name seemed to hang in the air for a beat too long. Rochelle blinked, then glanced back down at her list. Her fingers skimmed past luxury surnames and foundation donors, scanning once, twice, 3 times. The smile remained, but her voice cooled. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't see that name on the list." She straightened up, adjusting her posture. "This check-in is for confirmed VIP guests only." He nodded once. "It should be there." Before she could respond, a new voice sliced through the tension like a blade dipped in champagne. "Is there a problem here?" The voice belonged to Damian Cross. He walked with the authority of a man used to having doors opened for him before he even approached them. His linen suit was bone white, spotless, tailored to perfection. A gold watch peeked out from under his cuff as he slid off his sunglasses and studied the scene before him with a mixture of amusement and disdain. Rochelle looked relieved to see him. "This gentleman says his name is Keanu Reeves," she said, her voice dropping ever so slightly. "But his name isn't on the list." Damian let his gaze fall on Keanu slowly, starting with the scuffed shoes and ending at the brim of the baseball cap. He chuckled under his breath, not bothering to hide it, the kind of laugh meant to invite others to join in. "Who's Keanu Reeves?" he repeated, savoring the name like it was the punchline of a joke. "Well, that's a bold move." Keanu stood still, not defensive, not embarrassed, just calm. Damian stepped closer. This is a curated guest list. You don't just show up and expect to board. There are security checks, background screenings, contribution verifications. Do you have any idea what kind of event this is? Keanu met his eyes. Yes. Damian raised his eyebrows. Do you? He turned to Rochelle. Get security. Her fingers moved immediately toward the radio clipped to her belt. Keanu didn't flinch. There must be a mistake. There is, Damian said, folding his arms. You're at the wrong dock. A few nearby guests slowed their steps, catching the spectacle. A man in a velvet jacket laughed quietly, nudging his wife. Someone took out a phone and began recording discreetly. One of the guards arrived, tall, suited, and alert. He looked between Damian and Keanu, unsure where to step in. Would you mind waiting over there while we sort this out? Rochelle said, gesturing toward a metal bench set apart from the red carpet walkway. Her tone was polite, but the message was unmistakable. Get out of the way. Keanu nodded once. He didn't protest. He didn't argue. He simply walked to the bench and sat down, resting his backpack beside him. The procession of guests continued behind him. More limousines pulled in. More champagne was poured. Perfume lingered in the air, like entitlement. No one offered him a drink. No one welcomed him. No one asked if he needed help. As he sat quietly, the laughter of two young women rang out behind him. One lifted her phone and whispered, "Let's get a shot of him. Caption it, 'Guess the stowaway.'" They giggled as they took the photo. Keanu looked straight ahead, out over the water. He wasn't here for recognition. He wasn't here to prove anything. But every mocking glance, every whispered insult, they weren't just noticing him. They were revealing themselves. And none of them knew what was coming. From his seat on the bench, Keanu watched as the last few guests made their way up the ramp to board the yacht. The sun had begun to lower toward the horizon, bathing the sea in a soft amber glow. The water shimmered, calm and endless. In contrast, the luxury unfolding around him felt loud, artificial, and cold. No one made eye contact. The staff who passed him did so with stiff, practiced neutrality. Guests who noticed him whispered without discretion. One man, wearing loafers with no socks and carrying a cigar the size of a microphone, muttered as he walked by, "Probably some dock hand who got curious." The woman beside him didn't respond, but her smirk said enough. Nearby, Damian Cross stood with a group of investors, gesturing wildly with a flute of champagne in hand. He glanced toward Keanu from time to time, as if expecting him to take the hint and leave. But Keanu didn't move. He just sat quietly, observing, watching. The staff eventually resumed their routine. Rochelle spoke into her headset, murmuring about an identity check taking longer than expected. The security guard, still nearby, leaned against a post and scrolled through his phone, now more relaxed, but still keeping an eye on Keanu as if he were a suspicious package. After almost 20 minutes, one of the ship's junior assistants, a young man named Felix, approached the bench with a clipboard in hand. He looked nervous, like someone sent on an errand no one else wanted to take responsibility for. "Mr. Reeves?" Felix asked quietly. Keanu nodded. "I'm so sorry about the delay. There appears to be some confusion, but you're cleared. You're on the manifest just under a different listing protocol, private sponsor designation. I think your name was flagged to be kept off the public list." Keanu raised his eyebrows slightly. "Interesting." Felix swallowed. "Would you like to board now?" Keanu stood slowly. "Thank you." Felix turned to lead the way, but Keanu paused and looked back toward the crowd still gathered near the check-in canopy. Damian was deep in conversation, laughing as if nothing in the world could touch him. Rochelle was resetting the desk, preparing for the late arrivals. None of them noticed that Keanu had been cleared, and Keanu didn't correct them. He followed Felix quietly up the ramp, stepping aboard the Celestia without ceremony. No flashbulbs, no fanfare, just footsteps on polished wood and the creak of the deck beneath them. Behind him, the sea breeze picked up, tugging gently at the brim of his cap. The sun continued to set. On that bench he'd just left, the impression of his presence remained like a shadow burned into metal. And though no one on that dock knew it yet, the man they had mocked, ignored, and dismissed was about to change the tone of this entire voyage. Not with wealth, not with power, but with silence, grace, and truth. Night had fallen over the Mediterranean, and the Celestia glowed like a floating palace. Its lights shimmered against the dark sea, casting golden reflections across the water. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers along the upper deck, blending seamlessly with the clinking of champagne flutes and the rustle of evening gowns swaying in the breeze. Guests moved about as if on stage, every gesture was choreographed, every laugh calculated. Waiters passed by carrying silver trays of oysters, caviar, and miniature delicacies flown in that morning. Conversations hovered between finance, fashion, and philanthropy, each one a performance in subtle self-congratulation. Keanu walked alone along the main promenade of the ship, silent and unassuming. He hadn't changed, still in the same hoodie and jeans, same faded cap. He didn't look left or right to seek approval. He wasn't carrying a drink. He wasn't looking for anyone. He just walked slowly, letting the sea breeze hit his face. People noticed, not with admiration, not even with curiosity, more like confusion. They turned slightly, eyes lingering for a second longer than necessary. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Expressions tightened, as if his presence violated some unwritten aesthetic code of the luxury deck. A group of young influencers, 3 women and 1 man dressed in flowing silk and linen, sat lounged near the illuminated fountain bar. Their phones were already out, capturing angles of the evening meant to suggest effortless elegance. One of them, a woman with sleek hair and a diamond choker, nudged the girl beside her and gestured subtly toward Keanu. "He's back," she whispered. "The guy from the dock." "No way. What's he even doing up here?" the second replied, already raising her phone. The third girl laughed and opened Instagram. "Someone check if he's like a chef or something, or maybe he's just really committed to crashing this thing." The man in the group didn't look up. "He's definitely not on the influencer list. I would have noticed." As Keanu passed, the first girl angled her phone and discreetly hit record. She added a caption as the video uploaded, "When security forgets to lock the engine room." They laughed, quietly but cruelly. Keanu heard them. He said nothing. From across the lounge, Damian Cross stood with a circle of high-ranking executives and socialites. His laugh carried farther than most. His drink glimmered in the light, the color of gold filtered through ice. When he spotted Keanu walking near the glass railing, he turned slightly toward his group and said just loudly enough, "Some people really think they can change class just by changing location." One man chuckled. A woman looked over her shoulder, wrinkled her nose, then turned away. Keanu leaned against the railing and stared out at the black expanse of ocean. Waves rolled beneath them in silence. His reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. He wasn't looking for approval. He was waiting for something else entirely. As Keanu stood quietly near the railing, the buzz of the evening pulsed behind him. The chandelier-lit lounge remained filled with laughter, camera flashes, and conversations about hedge funds, art collections, and who wore what to last month's Monaco gala. But despite all the glitter, the air around him felt colder, sharper. Not because of the wind, but because of the invisible wall that had been built around him by whispered judgment and calculated side-eyes. A group of men in white dinner jackets played poker at a marble table to his left. They noticed him immediately. One of them, a bronzed man with slicked-back hair and a sharp jawline, tapped his ring on the table and leaned toward the others. "You think he's one of those weird social experiments?" he asked. "Like someone planted him here to see who's fake nice and—" Another guy laughed. "If that's true, then we already failed." Keanu's eyes remained on the sea. He didn't seem bothered by the stares or the whispers. In truth, he seemed somewhere else entirely, detached, like he was watching a memory replay through the waves. He moved only when a young waiter passed too closely, nearly stumbling with a tray of empty glasses. Keanu instinctively reached out and caught the tray before it tipped. The waiter looked startled, then embarrassed. "Thank you, sir," the young man said, regaining his grip. "I'm so sorry." "No problem," Keanu replied softly. The waiter hesitated. Are you okay?" Keanu looked at him and smiled faintly. "I'm fine. Just enjoying the quiet." The young man gave a nervous nod, then hurried away, but not before glancing back at Keanu once, as if trying to play something. Behind him, the influencers were still recording. The first girl had zoomed in to catch Keanu at the railing, framing the shot like he was part of the scenery rather than a guest. "This is luxury wildlife footage," she said, giggling. "Someone cue the David Attenborough voice." They laughed again, but this time their laughter felt thinner, less sure. A few nearby guests had started whispering, not about Keanu, but about the behavior of the ones recording. The tone was shifting, slowly and quietly, like a tide turning beneath the surface. Just then, the lounge doors opened again. More guests arrived, fresh from changing into evening attire. Each one glanced at Keanu as they passed, the same confused expression on every face. But no one approached him. No one said hello. No one asked him to join their table. And still, Keanu stood there, hands in his hoodie pocket, eyes on the dark horizon. He had every right to be there, but they treated him like he wasn't. And he let them. He let them show the world exactly who they were. The night deepened. The waves gently lapped against the hull of the Celestia, but inside the luxury lounge, the tension clung to the air, subtle and heavy. Though the music still played, though the wine still flowed, something had shifted. Keanu eventually moved away from the railing and walked slowly toward a quieter part of the deck. The noise behind him dimmed as he stepped into a corridor bathed in soft amber lights. The marble underfoot, the intricate woodwork, and the gold accents on the sconces all screamed opulence. But Keanu didn't seem impressed. He wasn't looking around the way newcomers did. He wasn't trying to blend in or escape notice. He simply existed. As he approached a small alcove near the back of the observation deck, a crew member in her mid-30s passed him. Her uniform was neat, her hair tied back tightly, a tray balanced expertly on one hand. She glanced at him briefly, then slowed. She turned around. "Excuse me," she said quietly, stepping closer. Keanu looked at her, expression calm. The woman hesitated, then lowered her voice to a whisper. "I just wanted to say thank you for earlier. For what you said to the maintenance guy at the dock." Keanu's brow furrowed slightly. "Helt told us," she continued. "Said you stood up for him when the sponsor tried to have him removed for not unloading fast enough. That's not the kind of thing people usually notice, especially not someone like, well, someone people don't recognize." Keanu's face remained unreadable, but he nodded slowly. "I wasn't trying to be noticed," he said. "I know," she replied. "That's why it meant more." With that, she gave a small, respectful nod and walked away. Keanu stood there for a moment, eyes lowered, hands still tucked in his hoodie pocket. Behind him, laughter rang out again from the lounge. Forced, performative, hollow. The difference between the real and the artificial was becoming more obvious with every passing hour. Back inside, Damian Cross noticed the shift too. He leaned against the edge of the bar, watching Keanu from a distance, his glass now half full. The smug grin on his face never quite faded, but something flickered in his eyes. Confusion, perhaps, or maybe annoyance. It was hard to tell. Beside him, one of his friends leaned in and asked, "Seriously, who is that guy?" Damian shrugged. "No one. Probably just someone who got a free pass through a charity auction." His voice carried farther than he realized. But Keanu didn't look back. He didn't react. He didn't need to. The ship sailed on into the night, dressed in its false brilliance, while one man moved through it like a mirror none of them wanted to see. And though they still didn't know his name, they would soon remember every moment they ignored him. The next morning arrived with clear skies and calm seas. Sunlight danced across the marble sun deck of the Celestia, catching the shimmer of gold-rimmed plates and crystal glasses. Waiters moved gracefully between tables draped in white linen, offering guests flutes of chilled champagne and carafes of freshly squeezed juice. The scent of buttered croissants, seared salmon, and tropical fruit mingled in the air. The brunch buffet had been described as effortlessly lavish in the promotional brochure, a phrase that seemed to define the entire voyage. Guests dressed the part. Flowing maxi dresses, pressed linen shirts, designer sunglasses, and wide-brimmed hats turned the deck into something between a fashion runway and a stockholder's retreat. Everyone had someone to talk to. Laughter rolled from table to table like a tide. Everyone except Keanu. He sat at a small table near the far end of the deck, slightly apart from the main circle of brunchgoers. His table had the same fine china and polished cutlery, but it felt invisible. No one greeted him. No one joined him. His plate was modest. Just a roll, a few pieces of fruit, and a glass of water. He sat calmly, chewing slowly, occasionally looking out over the sea. The hush that followed his presence was no longer surprised. It had morphed into something colder, calculated. He wasn't just ignored now. He was being watched. Not with curiosity, but with contempt. At a larger table in the center of the deck, a group of 5 wealthy guests sipped mimosas while pretending not to stare. One of them, a hedge fund manager from Texas with slick-back gray hair and expensive sunglasses pushed up into his hairline, leaned back in his seat with a theatrical sigh. "Jesus," he muttered, "who let the janitor into brunch?" The woman beside him choked on her laughter, pressing a napkin to her lips. "Oh my God," she whispered, grinning. "Stop." Another woman joined in. "Maybe he's part of some humble experience cruise package, like those billionaire boot camps." A third guest, younger and overdressed, squinted through her oversized glasses. "Do you think he's dangerous? I mean, look how he sits, like he doesn't care who's watching." Damian Cross, seated at the same table, didn't even glance up from his grapefruit. "He's not dangerous," he said flatly. "He's the stowaway I told you about." The others chuckled. One of the men raised his glass toward Keanu's table and said, "Bold of him to show up again. I respect the commitment." "I don't," Damian replied. "He doesn't carry shame because men like that don't know what dignity feels like." They all laughed harder this time. Keanu didn't react. He broke a small piece of bread and placed it in his mouth slowly. His face was unreadable. The ocean breeze lifted the edge of his hoodie. A shadow passed over the table, but he didn't look up. He had been insulted to his face, and yet he held still. A waiter approached Keanu's table, balancing a silver tray with a delicate plate of smoked salmon, avocado, and toasted brioche. But before he could place it down, Damian raised his voice just loud enough for half the deck to hear. "You sure that table's been cleared?" he called out with a smirk. "I'm pretty sure he's not a guest." The waiter froze mid-step. His eyes darted between Damian and Keanu, unsure of how to proceed. Guests nearby stopped eating, forks suspended mid-air. The young server, clearly new and uncomfortable, turned to Keanu with hesitation. I just wanted to..." "It's all right," Keanu said gently, reaching up and taking the plate himself. "I can serve myself." The waiter exhaled and stepped back with a grateful nod. "Oh, he speaks," someone muttered under their breath. Another guest added, "Careful, you'll spook him. He might scamper back to the engine room." Laughter burst from the table again. Champagne glasses clinked. One of the women leaned across her plate and whispered, "Do you think he's doing a social experiment? Like one of those YouTube things where they dress down and see how rich people treat them?" "Then he's picked the wrong crowd," Damian said, sipping from his glass. This isn't a psychology lab. This is curated excellence. From her chair, a woman wearing a white sun hat and pearl earrings nodded in agreement. He's clearly someone looking for attention. Another guest chuckled. Or just free food. At that, a younger woman, already a few drinks in before noon, stood and walked toward Keanu's table. She wobbled slightly on her heels, but kept her eyes locked on him. The laughter around her dimmed just enough for the crowd to pay attention. She stopped beside him and leaned in, her voice low but loud enough to carry. "Tell me," she slurred with a crooked smile, "do you actually think you're invisible here? Or do you just enjoy being pitied?" Keanu looked up at her, his expression neutral. She scoffed, straightened her shoulders, and added, "Or maybe you're just hoping someone rich takes you home like a stray dog." There was a pause, and then her table erupted into laughter again. Damian toasted her as she turned and sauntered back, basking in the attention. Keanu placed his fork down, folded his napkin slowly, and stood. He picked up the untouched plate of food and gently placed it on a nearby tray. Then he turned toward the table that had mocked him, eyes calm, voice quiet. "It's always fascinating," he said, "how the loudest insults come from the most fragile egos." And just like that, he walked away. No raised voice, no dramatic exit, just a steady, unshaken presence that somehow felt louder than all the laughter behind him. The jokes didn't continue, not right away. Something in the air had shifted. Keanu walked toward the far edge of the sun deck, passing polished railings and untouched fruit platters, putting distance between himself and the laughter that was already losing its confidence. He didn't move faster. He didn't need to. With every step, the mood behind him began to thin, like a party slowly realizing it wasn't as clever as it thought. The young woman who had delivered the insult glanced back at him from her table, expecting another reaction. But there was none. She reached for her champagne, hand trembling slightly. At the edge of the deck, Keanu stopped and leaned against the railing, gazing at the wide, endless blue of the sea. From there, he was framed by sunlight and silence. To anyone who looked closely, it wasn't defeat in his posture. It was something much more difficult to define. Something unshaken. A few moments later, a young waitress approached slowly from behind. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and a tray of empty glasses rested in her hands. She glanced toward the table that had mocked him, then turned her eyes to Keanu. She hesitated, then stepped closer. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu turned to her, his expression open but quiet. "You don't deserve that," she continued. "None of it. The way they treated you. It's wrong." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Thank you." The waitress looked down, then added softly, "You probably won't hear it from anyone else on this deck. But you should have." Keanu gave the faintest smile. She looked over her shoulder, nervous someone might see her speaking to him too long. Then she said, "I've served brunch on this yacht 3 years in a row. I've seen a lot of powerful people come and go. But you're the first one I've seen who didn't need an audience to have presence." Keanu didn't respond, but his eyes, softened by something more than gratitude, said enough. She gave a final nod, turned and walked away, her tray steady, her pace just a little more confident than before. At her table across the deck, one of the women noticed and muttered, "Now even the help's falling for his act." But the comment didn't carry. The air had changed. Some guests were no longer laughing. Some were watching him with new eyes, eyes beginning to question what they had seen, or, more importantly, what they hadn't. And as Keanu stood alone, facing the sea, the truth began to settle into the wood of the deck and the glass of the champagne flutes. Truth that couldn't be laughed away, filtered, or dressed up. Because even here, surrounded by excess, the smallest voice of dignity was beginning to echo. The sun had started its slow descent, casting soft shadows across the upper deck of the Celestia. Most of the guests had retreated to their suites to prepare for the evening's events. A formal cocktail hour followed by a private gala in the grand ballroom. The ship's crew moved briskly but quietly, polishing railings, adjusting lighting, setting tables with the kind of precision expected from a luxury voyage. But on the observation deck near the ship's stern, away from the chatter and footsteps, Keanu stood alone. The wind tugged gently at his hoodie, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon. The ocean stretched out like a curtain of calm, unbothered by wealth or reputation. It was the one part of the ship that didn't judge him. Footsteps approached from behind, measured, quiet, professional. A man in his early 40s, dressed in a dark navy blazer with a gold-embroidered ship emblem, stopped a few feet away. His name badge read, Julian Mercier, Guest Operations Director. He didn't interrupt right away. He let the silence linger respectfully, watching Keanu for a moment before speaking. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Julian said gently. Keanu glanced at him, then turned his eyes back to the water. "You're not." Julian stepped a little closer. "I wanted to say, I've seen how some of the guests have treated you." Keanu didn't reply. Julian continued, quieter now. "It hasn't gone unnoticed by all of us." There was a pause. The sound of water pushing softly against the hull filled the space between them. "You don't need to explain who you are," Julian added. "I know exactly who you are. But I also know that some don't." Still, Keanu said nothing. Julian took a breath. "I'm not here to justify any of it, only to offer a bit of advice." Keanu looked at him now, calm, unreadable. "There's a gala tonight," Julian said. "Formal dress, very exclusive. Certain guests have influence over the room, influence over how the evening unfolds. And I've heard things." Keanu's eyebrows raised slightly, but he remained silent. "I'm not saying you're unwelcome," Julian clarified. "But there's talk, whispers, about you, about your presence. And while I can't control what people say, I just want you to be aware." Keanu's voice was low, even. "You're suggesting I don't attend." Julian didn't flinch. "I'm suggesting that staying out of the ballroom tonight might save you unnecessary trouble." There was no threat in his tone, no superiority. It was kindness, laced with quiet discomfort. Keanu nodded once. "Thank you." Julian seemed to relax slightly. "I mean no disrespect." "You didn't give any," Keanu replied. The two men stood there in the stillness, the sea before them, the ship glowing behind them. It was a moment of mutual understanding, an acknowledgement that the world doesn't always reward dignity, and that silence can carry as much weight as action. As Julian turned to leave, Keanu followed slowly behind. But before stepping inside, he paused by the guest manifest, posted discreetly in the corridor wall. He scanned the list. His name still wasn't there. The guest manifest was framed in polished brass and backlit with warm LED strips, a decorative touch meant to give it the same reverence as a museum piece. Names were listed alphabetically, each followed by their suite number and sponsor affiliation. Keanu's eyes moved down the list, slowly, methodically. Tech CEOs, aristocrats, oil heirs, television personalities, each name carefully curated. But not his. He checked again. Nothing. His name wasn't just missing. It had been purposefully excluded. The anonymous designation Felix had mentioned the night he boarded had been more than a clerical footnote. It was intentional. Keanu stood there for a few more seconds, letting the weight of that choice settle. It explained a lot. The side glances, the doubt, the unchecked cruelty. People treated him like he didn't belong because, on paper, he didn't exist. Behind him, a pair of well-dressed guests walked by, deep in conversation. They didn't notice him standing by the manifest. One of them said, "I heard the gala's theme tonight is legacy through luxury. Sounds exhausting." The other replied, "I just hope they don't let in that guy from brunch again. What was his name?" "Doesn't matter." They kept walking, and their voices faded into the corridor. Keanu finally turned from the wall and headed toward his cabin. The hallway stretched ahead, its marble floors gleaming beneath the soft overhead lights. Along the way, a steward nodded politely as he passed, eyes flicking down to Keanu's clothes, then quickly away. No one asked where he was going. No one stopped him. The elevator to the lower guest quarters chimed softly as the doors slid open. Keanu stepped inside and pressed the button to his floor. As the doors closed, he caught one last glimpse of the grand staircase leading to the ballroom. The same staircase he now knew he wasn't expected to walk up. When he arrived at his suite, he paused outside the door. He could hear faint music drifting through the walls from a neighboring room, something elegant and familiar, probably part of the string quartet rehearsing for the gala. He stepped inside. The room was simple compared to the penthouse-level suites. No grand piano, no walk-in wine cellar, just soft carpeting, a window that overlooked the sea, and a small table where someone had left a printed schedule of the evening's events. Keanu picked it up and scanned the itinerary. There it was. 8:00 p.m., Legacy Gala, formal attire required, ballroom entry by name only. Below that, a single line printed in smaller type. Non-listed guests may enjoy the promenade lounge and observation deck during this time. The message was clear, polite, painless, but unmistakably exclusionary. Keanu folded the paper and set it down without a word. Then he moved to the window and watched the waves break in the moonlight, the distant sky beginning to fade from blue to deep purple. He had not been banned. He had been erased. For several minutes, Keanu remained by the window, watching the sea ripple beneath the hull. The colors of twilight melted into one another, indigo giving way to violet, then fading into black. From this height, the ocean looked endless, silent, unimpressed by wealth or status. It moved at its own rhythm, untouched by the games of men. A soft knock interrupted the quiet. Keanu turned as the door opened gently and a young steward entered, holding a garment bag. "Mr. Reeves," the steward said, careful and respectful. "Evening refresh service. Would you like me to press this jacket for the gala?" Keanu looked at the suit hanging inside the bag. Simple, dark, nothing flashy. He paused, then shook his head. "No need," he said. "I won't be attending." The steward looked up, surprised but too professional to question it. "Very well, sir." He took the suit and carefully placed it in the closet, then checked the minibar before offering a courteous nod and exiting the room. As the door clicked shut, Keanu turned back to the window. His reflection stared back at him, faint, transparent against the black sea. He wasn't angry, not even disappointed. He just understood. This was what the world did. It polished names and buried people. It created lists not just to celebrate inclusion, but to signal who didn't matter. But none of that changed who he was. Down in the main hall, music began to swell. The hum of guests greeting one another, the clatter of heels on marble, the rising excitement of excess. All of it started to echo up through the walls of the ship, like the sound of a show starting without him. He didn't move. Instead, he unzipped his backpack and pulled out a single paperback book. The corners were frayed, the spine well-worn. He sat on the small sofa, propped open the book, and began to read by the light of a single lamp. No performance, no audience, just a man who had already made peace with who he was. Half an hour passed. Then an hour. Outside his room, the energy of the ship climbed higher and higher. Toasts were being made. Music floated across the decks. Photographers moved between tables. Damian Cross's laugh rose above the others more than once. But in Suite 114, none of it mattered. Keanu turned another page. Eventually he stood, walked back to the window, and looked once more out into the night. It was all still there. The water, the wind, and the silence that told the truth more clearly than any voice in that ballroom ever could. He wasn't supposed to attend the gala. But what no one realized yet What not even Damian Cross understood was that the man they tried to exclude had already become the center of their story, and the night was far from over. The second evening on the Celestia unfolded like a symphony of elegance. The yacht's lounge glowed under a constellation of chandelier lights. Velvet curtains framed panoramic views of the Mediterranean, and a grand piano near the center gleamed beneath soft golden fixtures. Wine glasses chimed against crystal. Conversation swirled like perfume. This was the evening crowd, the polished, the pedigreed, the self-convinced elite. The music softened as a pianist in a black tuxedo took the bench and began playing a quiet, haunting melody. All eyes turned as a few guests moved toward the grand piano area to listen. It was the kind of moment meant for quiet admiration and hushed awe. But it didn't stay that way. Keanu had entered the lounge through a side passage, unnoticed at first. He wasn't dressed for spectacle, still in his hoodie, jeans, and that same old cap. He walked slowly along the edge of the room, pausing near the far side of the piano, content to stand in the shadows and simply listen to the music. Then Damian Cross noticed him. He was seated at the bar with 3 associates, half a glass of bourbon in his hand. He saw Keanu just beyond the pianist and narrowed his eyes with the unmistakable look of a man who couldn't resist a performance, even if it came at someone else's expense. Damian stood and raised his voice, just enough for the room to hush. "Well, look who's back." Heads turned, conversations froze. The pianist faltered slightly but kept playing. Damian strolled across the lounge with exaggerated grace, his drink still in hand, that familiar smirk already forming. His words rang out over the gentle chords. "I thought the engine room had a strict uniform policy," he said loudly. "Guess we're letting staff roam free these days." A few people laughed, softly, nervously. Others glanced around to see who would react first. Keanu stood still, saying nothing. Damian came closer, gesturing toward him with his glass like a game show host. "Don't be shy, friend. Tell us, what's the maintenance schedule for tomorrow? Or are you just here to check the pipes under the piano?" More laughter now, louder. One of the women near the bar clinked her glass and added, "At least the crew's getting bold." Keanu looked at Damian calmly. No anger, no defensiveness, just steady composure. Damian wasn't finished. "You know what I admire most about you? The commitment. Really. It takes nerve to keep showing up in that outfit. Some people fake being rich. You," he laughed, "you fake being invisible." The room tensed. Some guests smiled uncomfortably. Others looked down at their glasses. Then Keanu stepped forward, not toward Damian, but just enough that his voice could be heard by the room. "It's fascinating," he said quietly, "how you confuse wealth with worth." The moment landed with a sharpness that silenced even the laughter. Keanu's voice hadn't risen. He hadn't moved quickly. But somehow his words echoed louder than Damian's mocking tone ever could. Damian blinked, just once. Then the smirk returned, but it was thinner now, stretched too tight to hide the sting. "Well," Damian said, circling Keanu slowly, "that's quite a line. You been rehearsing that one in the mirror of your cabin? Or did someone ghostwrite it for you? Maybe a motivational quote from a fortune cookie?" He turned to the room, inviting them to laugh again. A few chuckled. Most didn't. Keanu didn't move. His gaze stayed locked not on Damian's face, but slightly past it, as if he was looking through the man, not at him. "You look around and think you see value," Keanu said, his voice still calm, "but all you're seeing is your own reflection. That's the problem with living in a mirror." A beat passed. Damian's jaw tightened. One of his associates let out a sharp laugh, trying to break the tension. "Okay, Socrates, take it easy." But no one else joined him, not this time. The pianist had stopped playing completely now. His fingers hovered above the keys, but the music had died the moment Keanu spoke. The lounge held its breath. Damian shifted, trying to regain the upper hand. "You know what I think," he said, stepping in close. "You want us to notice you. That's all this is. The quiet act, the hoodie, the sad little solo brunch. It's bait. You want someone to ask your name so you can pretend to be someone." Keanu didn't blink. Damian leaned in further, lowering his voice so only the nearest guests could hear. "But here's the truth," he whispered. "No one cares. Not really. You're just a shadow in the corner of someone else's spotlight. And the only thing worse than being invisible is being irrelevant." Then, louder, he added, "You don't belong here." Silence followed. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "And yet, I'm here." Damian straightened up, not for long. He tossed back the rest of his bourbon and turned sharply, waving dismissively over his shoulder. The moment should have ended there, but it didn't. As Damian walked back toward the bar, a few guests followed him with their eyes. Some wore amused expressions, waiting for the tension to break. But one older gentleman, seated near the back of the room in a navy dinner jacket, watched Keanu with quiet intensity. His name was Albert Monroe, founder of a global shipping empire, known for his silence more than his speeches. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes wasn't judgment. It was curiosity, a kind of remembering. Like something about Keanu had unsettled something deeper inside him, something that money had long taught him to forget. Damian returned to his group, laughing louder than necessary as if the echo of his voice might erase the words Keanu had left hanging in the room. But the atmosphere had changed. The laughter now was scattered and half-hearted, unsure of itself. A few guests smiled, but their eyes wandered. Others stared into their drinks, visibly uncomfortable. At the far end of the lounge, Keanu remained where he was, calm and unshaken. He didn't look back toward Damian. He didn't seek validation. Instead, he turned and walked slowly toward a large window facing the sea. He stood there in silence, watching the last light of day sink into the ocean, the waves catching hues of violet and gold. The pianist finally placed his hands back on the keys. He began playing again, something slow, something reflective. The notes floated through the tension like a balm, but they couldn't mask what had happened. Albert Monroe continued watching Keanu. After a long pause, he leaned toward the woman seated beside him. His wife of 40 years, a quiet woman who hadn't spoken all evening. "Albert said more in 2 sentences than that boy said in 2 years, Albert murmured. She nodded slowly, never taking her eyes off Keanu. Across the room, one of the younger women who had laughed earlier glanced again in Keanu's direction. Her expression had softened. The joke didn't feel funny anymore. If anything, it felt cruel in a way that lingered. She reached for her phone and quietly deleted the photo she had taken of him the day before. Even the bartender, who had spent most of the trip observing in silence, gave Keanu a subtle nod as he polished a glass behind the counter. Back at the bar, Damian poured himself another drink, but the victory he had tried to craft was already slipping through his fingers. He glanced over at Monroe, caught the older man's unblinking gaze, and looked away. His confidence was still intact, but now it was forced, tight, hollow. Keanu stood by the window for several more minutes, unmoving. No one approached him. No one asked him to leave. No one dared mock him again, at least not tonight, because something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. The ones who had watched him like he didn't belong were starting to realize he never needed permission to. As the piano played on and the shadows of night took over the water, Keanu turned and quietly exited the lounge. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. The message had landed, and somewhere deep in the minds of those who had laughed, a single thought had taken root. Maybe the man they tried to dismiss wasn't the one out of place after all. That evening, the dining hall reserved for high-level investors was quieter than the rest of the ship. A long glass-enclosed terrace jutted out from the port side, giving a sweeping view of the darkening sea. Dinner was served in hushed tones by white-gloved staff. Each table was lit with a soft pendant light that glowed like candlelight, and a harpist played near the far wall, her music barely louder than the clinking of silverware. It was an invitation-only dinner. Small, exclusive, deliberately understated, the kind of gathering where power sat quietly, measured in glances and subtle nods rather than noise or applause. Keanu entered without being stopped. Technically, no one told him he couldn't be there. There was no security at the door, no name list checked. He simply walked in, scanned the room, and found the one seat left unclaimed, near the far end of the terrace, closest to the window. No one called out. No one invited him over. And yet, no one stopped him either. He didn't wear anything new, still the hoodie, the jeans, the quiet energy that neither demanded nor apologized. He poured himself a glass of water and began his meal. Steamed vegetables, rice, and a piece of grilled fish. Nothing extravagant. He ate slowly, mindfully, while watching the stars reflect on the water beyond the glass. Across the room, at the center table, sat Lawrence Carlyle, CEO of a multinational aerospace company. Tall, silver-haired, with the posture of a man used to being heard the first time he spoke. At his side was his daughter Elise, mid-20s, in a forest green dress. She leaned in and whispered, "Dad, that guy near the window? Doesn't he look like Keanu Reeves?" Lawrence glanced in Keanu's direction briefly, then returned to cutting his lamb. "Elise," he said dryly, "Keanu Reeves doesn't take economy trips on yachts." She smirked. "There is no economy section on this boat." "Exactly," he said. "He wouldn't be eating alone if that were him." She leaned back in her chair but kept watching Keanu out of the corner of her eye. Keanu, meanwhile, had heard every word. Not because they were loud, but because silence has a way of amplifying even the softest conversation. He didn't react. He didn't turn toward them. But there was a slight lift at the corner of his mouth, a flicker of something between amusement and understanding. It wasn't the first time someone doubted who he was, and it wouldn't be the last. But what they didn't realize was that he wasn't trying to be recognized. In fact, he was here to be forgotten. The evening continued with quiet elegance. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, refilling glasses and clearing plates. The harpist played a piece so gentle it could barely be heard, as if not to disturb the conversations floating quietly around the room. Lawrence Carlyle remained deep in discussion with two European investors seated beside him. They spoke about aerospace regulations, green propulsion models, and market forecasts. He never once looked back toward the man by the window, but Elise did. She stole glances every few minutes, her expression somewhere between intrigue and uncertainty. Something about the way Keanu sat apart from the room, calm, unhurried, undemanding, unsettled her. It wasn't just that he looked familiar. It was that he didn't seem to care whether he was noticed at all. At one point, as a waiter passed by with dessert options, she asked quietly, "Would you mind finding out who that gentleman is over there?" The waiter blinked. "Mr. Reeves?" Elise tilted her head. "So, that is Keanu Reeves?" The waiter nodded, with a soft smile. "Yes, miss. He's been very kind. Doesn't ask for much." She turned toward her father, almost smug. "Told you." Lawrence didn't answer. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, more carefully this time. His expression shifted ever so slightly. Not embarrassment, but calculation. "I didn't think," he murmured, then trailed off. Elise raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think what?" He didn't respond. Instead, he finished his drink and waved away the dessert tray. From the far table, Keanu remained unfazed. He hadn't touched his dessert. He simply sipped his water, still watching the ocean, his posture relaxed, as if he were more at home with the sea than with the luxury surrounding him. He could feel the shift. It was subtle, but familiar. The kind of attention that came not from admiration, but from a recalibration of status. People realizing he might be someone they should have acknowledged earlier. Lawrence Carlyle leaned in toward one of his assistants, seated a few chairs down. "Pull up a search on him," he said under his breath. "Now." The assistant reached for his phone and began typing discreetly beneath the table. It took seconds. The results lit up his screen in flashes. Actor, philanthropist, icon, a list of films, articles about random acts of kindness, quotes about humility, reports of major donations, stories of grief, solitude, and loyalty. The assistant turned the screen toward Lawrence, who took one look and froze. There, in a grainy photo, was the very same man sitting alone by the window, wearing the same hoodie, the same quiet face. Lawrence said nothing, but something in his face changed. Not just recognition, regret. Lawrence sat back in his chair, his posture no longer stiff with certainty but softened by realization. He glanced once more toward Keanu, who hadn't moved, hadn't looked up, hadn't done anything to demand a moment like this. And yet, here it was, unavoidable. The assistant, unsure what to say next, leaned in and whispered, "He's worth hundreds of millions. Donated more than half of it. Stays out of the spotlight." Lawrence gave a slight nod, but his mind was far from the numbers. He was replaying the past hour in fragments. His own dismissiveness, the way he had spoken to Elise, the assumption that someone alone must be no one. And now that assumption sat in front of him, perfectly still, unmoved, quietly exposing the shallowness of it all. "Do you want me to introduce you?" the assistant asked. Lawrence hesitated. "No," he said finally, "not tonight." He turned to Elise, who was now watching him with raised eyebrows. "You were right," he admitted quietly. Her smile didn't gloat. It was thoughtful. "You could still go say something." Lawrence shook his head. "I already said enough." The harpist's final notes lingered as waitstaff began clearing the tables. The evening was winding down. Guests rose, chairs scraping softly against the floor, and began trickling toward the hallway that led back to the main deck. Keanu stood too. He placed his napkin on the table, took one last look out at the sea, and then walked calmly toward the exit. As he passed through the terrace, a few guests stepped aside instinctively, not quite knowing why. They didn't speak, they just moved. Lawrence watched him go. His eyes followed Keanu not with the gaze of a CEO evaluating a potential deal, but with something rarer. Humility. He whispered to Elise. The room didn't shift when he walked in. It shifted when he didn't need to. She nodded slowly. "That's presence, Dad." Keanu didn't glance back as he exited the room. The corridor swallowed his silhouette, and the sound of footsteps faded into silence. Later that night, Lawrence sat in his cabin with a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. The television was on, muted. He wasn't watching it. Instead, he sat at the small desk, Keanu's profile open on his tablet. News stories, photos, old interviews. One quote stood out, written beneath an image of Keanu giving away his seat on a subway. "You never know what battles people are fighting. So be kind, always." Lawrence read the line several times, each one slower than the last. He closed the tablet, leaned back, and sighed. Not because he felt ashamed of not recognizing a famous man, but because he had recognized something else far too late. Character. And that, he now understood, had nothing to do with names on lists or tables reserved by title. The morning of day 3 brought a stillness to the Celestia that felt almost ceremonial. The Mediterranean sparkled beneath the cloudless sky, the water calm as glass. On the upper pool deck, guests lounged beneath umbrellas in designer swimwear, sipping fresh juice and cucumber water as upbeat music played from hidden speakers. The luxury was constant, but the mood was quieter than it had been. The previous evening's tension still lingered, like the remnants of a scent you can't quite place. It wasn't being talked about directly, but there were glances, slight hesitations, that unspoken awareness that something beneath the surface had shifted. At one end of the deck, Damian Cross held court near a cluster of cabanas. He wore aviator sunglasses, gold-rimmed and mirrored, and a pale blue shirt unbuttoned just enough to show off a gold chain. He leaned back in a cushioned chair, surrounded by 3 other men and a woman in a wide sun hat, all laughing a little too loud. "I told the guy straight to his face," Damian was saying, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You want your tip? Don't make me wait for my wine. Simple as that." The others chuckled, and one of the men added, "Half of these guys forget they're lucky just to be on board. The way they act, you'd think they own the place." Damian nodded, lifting his glass. "Entitlement is a virus." Across the deck, a young waiter carrying a tray of drinks stepped onto the polished stone. A ripple of commotion behind him caused him to turn slightly. The moment of distraction was all it took. His foot caught the edge of a step, and the tray tipped. Glasses crashed to the ground. One shattered completely, sending shards skittering near the foot of Damian's lounge chair. The music didn't stop, but the conversation did. All heads turned. The waiter froze, eyes wide, hands still outstretched as if trying to catch what had already fallen. Damian looked down at the spilled drinks, then up at the waiter. "Unbelievable," he said with a slow shake of his head. "You people are paid to carry glasses, not juggle them." No one laughed this time. The waiter knelt down quickly, his hands trembling as he began collecting the pieces. Everyone watched. No one helped. Until Keanu stood. He had been sitting on the far side of the deck, reading a paperback beneath the shade. Quiet, as always. Dressed the same, not trying to be noticed. He walked calmly over, knelt beside the waiter, and began picking up the larger shards, careful not to cut himself. He said nothing, but his presence made people shift in their seats. His stillness was louder than any rebuke. The waiter looked up, stunned. "Sir, you don't have to—" Keanu nodded once, simply and firmly. Together, they cleaned the mess. And for the first time that trip, more than a few people began to wonder, who was he, really? As Keanu and the waiter worked together, the surrounding guests grew uncomfortably quiet. Some turned away, pretending not to see. Others stared openly, confused by what they were witnessing. It wasn't just the act of helping. It was the grace with which it was done. No words, no show, no righteousness, just quiet action. The waiter offered a grateful smile. "Thank you, sir." "Really?" Keanu gave a small nod, then stood and handed him the last unbroken glass. He walked back to his chair without another word. The sound of the music seemed to grow louder, as if the ship itself was trying to distract from the discomfort left behind. Damian leaned back, attempting to salvage control of the moment. "Well," he said, raising his voice again, "at least someone found a job that fits. Maybe he'll get a tip this time." The joke landed like a stone. One of his friends laughed weakly, but it died almost instantly. The woman in the sun hat didn't smile at all. In the middle of this uneasy silence, a young girl stood near the edge of the pool. Maybe 8 years old? She had been watching from a few chairs down, her swim towel wrapped around her shoulders like a cape. Her mother sat beside her, looking down at her phone. The girl stared at Keanu with wide eyes. Then, tugging her mom's arm, she whispered, "Mom, that's him." Her mother glanced up. "Who, sweetie?" Dared to murmur. "The man. The one from the movies. That's him, right?" The mother looked toward Keanu, who had returned to his seat and picked up his book again. She squinted, trying to see past the hoodie, the cap, the quiet presence. The girl whispered again, "That's Keanu Reeves." The name cut through the air like a spark in a dark room. The mother froze, her eyes narrowing. She looked again, this time longer. Recognition settled on her face like a wave rising in slow motion. Her expression shifted, her phone lowered to her lap. "Oh my God," she whispered. The little girl beamed. "I told you." She stepped away from her chair, started toward Keanu, then paused and turned back. "Can I say hi?" Her mom shook her head quickly. No, not now. Maybe later." but the words had already begun to ripple. A couple seated 2 rows behind them leaned in. "What did she say?" the woman whispered. "I think she said that's Keanu Reeves." Another voice from the pool's edge asked, "Wait, are you serious?" Within seconds, more heads turned. The shift was subtle but definite. Guests who had once ignored him now looked twice. A few picked up their phones. Others whispered his name, testing it against the face they had dismissed for 2 days. Keanu didn't look up. He turned a page in his book, completely still. But across the deck, the weight of recognition had begun to spread, and with it, a quiet unease. The quiet murmurs swelled like a rising tide. People who had previously whispered about the stowaway or laughed at the man in the hoodie were now pulling up search results on their phones beneath their towels, covertly scrolling through photos, comparing cheekbones and jawlines, mouths slowly falling open. "That's him," someone muttered near the towel station. "Oh my God, I think it is," came another voice. Damian caught the stir. He watched the girl whisper again to her mom, watched the mother's eyes widen as she confirmed what her daughter had seen. His jaw clenched. He looked toward Keanu's chair. Still the same hoodie, still the same jeans, still the same man reading a book, completely unfazed. But now, that face was being seen differently. Damian rose from his chair and adjusted his sunglasses. The whispering didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder. The waiter Keanu had helped earlier returned to the deck with a broom and dustpan and gave him a small, respectful nod as he passed. This time, no one mocked him for it. A guest walked past Keanu with her camera phone ready, pretending to record the ocean, but she angled the lens just slightly to catch him in the frame. He noticed. He always noticed. Still, he didn't flinch. The girl tugged her mother's hand again. "Please, Mom, I want to say hi." Her mother hesitated, then gave in. "Just be polite, okay? Don't bother him." The little girl walked quietly across the deck and stopped a few feet from Keanu's chair. Her voice was soft, timid. "Hi, Mr. Reeves." Keanu looked up, eyes kind. "Hi. I saw your movie. The one where you saved the dog. My dad showed me. It was really cool." Keanu gave her a gentle smile. "I'm glad you liked it." The girl fidgeted. "Can I tell my friends I met you?" "You just did," he said kindly. She grinned and ran back to her mom, who now looked visibly shaken. The whispering grew sharper now. More people reached for their phones. A couple tried to confirm what was happening with a crew member nearby. "Is that really him?" "I think it is." The crew member didn't answer, but the look on his face said enough. Damian turned away, muttering something under his breath. He grabbed his drink and drained it faster than usual. Across the deck, Keanu stood and quietly folded his book. He placed it inside his backpack and slung it over one shoulder. As he turned to walk away, he passed the young girl and her mother. The mother looked up, ready to speak, maybe to apologize, but Keanu just nodded once, a gesture that held no judgment, only peace. He walked past the cabanas and back toward the interior of the ship. The child watched him go. Her mother placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder and whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, that man was Keanu Reeves. And suddenly, the silence felt heavier than any of the laughter that had come before. The captain's gala was the crown jewel of the voyage. Held in the grand ballroom, it was a night designed to dazzle. Everything shimmered. Chandeliers made of imported crystal, hand-polished marble floors, silk table linens embroidered with gold thread. A live string quartet played near the entrance, and champagne was poured from bottles chilled in carved ice sculptures shaped like dolphins leaping through waves. The dress code was strict, black tie only, no exceptions. Guests filtered in one by one, each more polished than the last. Tuxedos tailored within an inch of the body, gowns that swept the floor like liquid moonlight. Every entrance was a performance, every smile a mask rehearsed for the cameras, even if there were no actual cameras. Damian Cross arrived early. He wore a white tuxedo jacket, a crimson boutonniere, and a grin as wide as the ballroom itself. This was his stage. He shook hands, clinked glasses, and told stories just loud enough for nearby tables to catch the punchline. His laugh floated above the music like it belonged there. As more guests arrived, the volume in the room rose. Laughter echoed under the chandeliers. Crystal clinked. Staff moved like shadows between tables, discreet and efficient. Then the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened slowly, and Keanu walked in. Fanfare, no announcement. He wore the same hoodie, same jeans, same old sneakers, the same quiet confidence. At first, no one noticed. The music continued, the conversations flowed, but as he stepped farther into the room, heads turned. Slowly at first, then faster. One by one, faces shifted from curiosity to confusion to something colder. Damian saw him and froze mid-sentence. Then, grinning wide, he set down his glass and raised his voice above the crowd. "You've got to be kidding me." A ripple of silence followed. Damian took a few steps forward, hands open in exaggerated disbelief. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've found our entertainment for the evening." A few guests chuckled, soft, uncertain. Others just stared. Keanu stood near the entrance, unmoved. Damian laughed, louder now, circling him like a game show host. "I mean, really? This is just too good. Same outfit, same boots, same backpack, and here I thought the theme was black tie, not thrift store chic." The string quartet faltered. One of the violinists dropped his bow. Damian turned toward the security team posted discreetly near the doors. He gestured with a flourish. "Gentlemen, please. Escort the stray out before someone mistakes him for a valet." The guards hesitated. They looked at Keanu, then at each other. No one moved. Keanu didn't speak. He didn't argue. He simply looked at the crowd, at every face that had turned to witness this moment. His eyes scanned the room slowly, deliberately, as if memorizing it. Not with anger, not with shame, just clarity. Then he turned, without a word, and walked back through the open doors. The silence left behind was deafening. The grand ballroom, moments ago overflowing with voices and laughter, now felt hollow. The air held something thick and uneasy, like smoke after a fire. Guests shifted in their seats, unsure whether to resume conversation or pretend nothing had happened. Some looked down at their plates. Others looked toward Damian, who still stood grinning, but now with slightly less conviction. No one applauded. No one followed Keanu. The string quartet hesitated, then resumed playing a soft waltz, but the notes felt detached, disconnected from the pulse of the room. It was music without rhythm, melody without meaning. Damian tried to lighten the mood, raising his glass again. "Well," he said, voice louder now, "let that be a lesson in dress codes." A weak laugh sputtered from a nearby table, but it didn't spread. A few feet away, a woman in a silver dress whispered to her husband. "That really was him, wasn't it?" He didn't respond. Another couple sat frozen, their forks untouched, watching the doorway as if waiting for Keanu to return. He didn't. At the head table near the stage, the captain of the ship leaned toward his assistant. "Was he invited?" he asked quietly. The assistant nodded, almost regretfully. "Anonymous sponsor, one of the largest donors on board." The captain's face paled. "And no one told me?" "Me." Didn't want to draw attention, his team insisted. A hush moved through the staff like a shadow. Meanwhile, outside the ballroom, Keanu walked alone down the main corridor. His pace was steady, his face calm. He wasn't storming off, wasn't defeated. He walked like a man who had already known how the night would unfold. A crew member, stationed just past the ballroom doors, stepped aside respectfully as Keanu passed. The man looked like he wanted to say something, perhaps to apologize, but Keanu gave him a small nod, the kind that said, "It's okay." Back inside, Damian finally sat back down, swirling his drink with a forced air of satisfaction. But his posture had changed. A nervous twitch had returned to the corner of his mouth. The woman beside him leaned in. "Are you sure that was just some stowaway?" she asked quietly. Damian's grin wavered. "He's no one." She stared at him. "He didn't feel like no one." Damian said nothing. On the far side of the ballroom, Elise Carlyle sat next to her father, still holding her champagne flute, untouched. Her eyes hadn't left the entrance. Lawrence Carlyle sighed. They just made a very big mistake. She turned to him. "Should we do something?" He shook his head. "No, we already didn't." A long pause followed. Then he added, "But I will find out who approved that guest list." The string quartet played on. The chandeliers shimmered. The wine flowed. But something had cracked. Something invisible but loud. And as the night wore on, no matter how much music played, no matter how many courses were served, the truth couldn't be unseen. They hadn't thrown out a nobody. They had humiliated the very man who made their evening possible. And deep down, they all knew it. The ballroom dimmed. The chandeliers overhead softened from crystal white to a golden hue as the quartet played a final flourish and faded into silence. A quiet hush swept the room. Guests looked around, expecting another course or a toast. Instead, a spotlight flickered to life at the front of the stage. A tall woman in a black evening gown stepped forward. She was elegant, composed, and carried the tone of someone used to delivering news that made people lean in. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and measured. "Before we continue this evening with the charity auction, we have a very special announcement." Chairs shifted, heads turned. Damian raised an eyebrow, leaning slightly forward. The woman continued, "As many of you know, this voyage was made possible by the support of several generous sponsors. Each of you has contributed not only to the luxury of this experience, but more importantly, to the Children's Cancer Fund we've come together to support." Polite applause followed. A few guests clinked glasses. Some glanced back at the buffet table, assuming this was just formal filler. "But," she said, her tone changing slightly, "one individual among you went far beyond what we could have imagined. Before ever stepping aboard, this person contributed over $2.5 million to fully fund the operating costs of the voyage. Because of that contribution, 100% of every donation made tonight will go directly to the children and families we're here to help." That got their attention. Murmurs rippled across the room. Forks were set down. Conversations paused mid-sentence. "2.5 million, someone whispered from the third table. "That can't be right," said another. "Who was it?" asked a guest near the bar. "Was it Damian?" Damian straightened slightly, a smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. His fingers tapped the stem of his wine glass as if preparing for a cue. The woman at the podium smiled graciously. "This donor wished to remain anonymous, but tonight, after much urging from our team and others aboard, they've agreed to allow us to acknowledge them properly." The room fell completely silent. The quartet had stopped playing. The only sound was the subtle hum of the ship itself. Damian's smirk stiffened. Someone behind him whispered, "It must be Carlyle." Or Hawthorne. The director took a slow breath. "It is my honor to introduce not only a sponsor, but a man whose humility, generosity, and grace have deeply moved our entire crew." She turned toward the double doors at the back of the room. A second spotlight illuminated the entrance. Every eye turned. The crowd watched as the doors opened, and Keanu Reeves walked in. Same hoodie, same jeans, same steady walk. But now, there was no mistaking him. The whisperers stopped. A champagne flute slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the marble. Gasps followed. One woman clutched her necklace. Another lowered her phone in shame. Keanu didn't slow his step. He walked straight into the light. Keanu walked toward the podium as if none of the past 3 days had happened, as if no one had laughed, as if no one had whispered, mocked, or tried to erase him. He moved with the quiet strength of someone who didn't need to prove anything. That was what stunned the room the most. Not the money, not the name, not even the recognition. It was the calm, the absence of anger. The man they had dismissed was now standing in front of them, not to accuse, not to shame, but to speak. When Keanu reached the stage, the director stepped aside with a quiet bow. He nodded to her, then turned to the crowd. He waited. No microphone, no speech cards, just silence and breath. When he finally spoke, it was not loud, but every word carried. "I wasn't here to be seen," he said, his voice low, steady. "I didn't come to impress anyone. I didn't dress to belong. I came to observe." Some shifted in their seats. Others stared down into their drinks. "I wanted to understand," he continued, "how people treat others when they believe there's nothing to gain." The weight of his words fell over the room like a blanket, heavy. "I've been laughed at," he said. "Ignored, pushed aside. I've had cameras pointed at me like I was a joke. But I never reacted, not because I didn't care, but because I wanted to see who would." He paused, scanning the room. "I saw entitlement. I saw cruelty passed off as humor. I saw people more concerned with appearances than character. And I saw others, few but present, who noticed, who hesitated, who regretted. No one moved. "I'm not here to shame anyone," he said, "but I will tell you this. Generosity is not about money. It's about presence. It's about how you treat people when there is no spotlight." From the back, someone whispered his name. Not loud, not accusatory, just reverent. Keanu stepped back slightly. "I don't want applause. I don't want headlines. I just want one thing." He looked toward the captain. "Use what you've seen here tonight to become better people." Then, to the crowd, "We all came here hoping to escape something. Maybe boredom, maybe guilt, maybe just the world outside. But what you can never escape is your own reflection." He nodded once more, then walked away from the podium. No music played. No one clapped. They couldn't, because the moment wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As Keanu walked through the ballroom, the crowd parted like water. Not because he was famous, but because, for the first time, they saw the depth of what they had missed. He passed Damian without looking at him. Damian didn't speak. He passed the woman who had mocked him with the glass raised, her eyes dropped to the floor. He passed the child who had seen him first. She smiled, he smiled back, and then he left the room in silence. But his absence was louder than any sound they'd heard all night. Keanu stood still beneath the spotlight. The golden light curved around him, catching the edges of his worn hoodie, his jeans, and the quiet strength in his eyes. Not one guest moved. The room, packed with power, fame, and fortune, had fallen utterly silent. He looked around, taking his time, the kind of stillness that made people hold their breath. He didn't need volume, he had presence. When he finally spoke, the words came gently, but they struck like thunder. "I didn't come here to be admired," he said, eyes sweeping across the ballroom. "I didn't come here to be envied, or photographed, or judged." He paused. No one dared interrupt. "I came not to impress," he said again, "but to observe." A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. The weight of his voice wasn't angry. It was heavier than anger. It was honest. "And what I saw," Keanu continued, his voice steady, "broke my heart." A woman 2 tables back gasped softly. Someone else set down their wine glass with shaking fingers. "I saw kindness from the crew," he said. "From those paid to serve. I saw humility in the eyes of strangers. And I saw cruelty masked as charm from some of the most well-dressed people I've ever met." He didn't point. He didn't name names. But people knew. He went on. I saw people measure others by fabric, by posture, by silence. And I watched those same people speak loudly to prove they were better. I listened as people joked, not realizing they were handing out pieces of their character with every word. Damian Cross stared straight ahead. His smile was gone. The corner of his mouth twitched, but his eyes were fixed in a hollow gaze. "I'm not here to scold," Keanu said, softer now. "That's not my role. I'm not interested in punishing anyone, but I do want to leave you with something." He let the silence hold for another moment. "I've walked through life invisible before, as a child, as a young actor, as a man in mourning. I've heard the same kinds of laughs, the same doubts, the same rejection." Someone near the front lowered their eyes. "But this wasn't just about me. It was about all the people you don't notice. The ones who refill your drinks, the ones who press your suits, the ones who say good morning when you don't say it back." He looked toward the crew standing at the edge of the ballroom. They didn't smile. They didn't blink. They just watched, wide-eyed, with something that looked like gratitude. "You wear your wealth like armor," Keanu said, "but you forget that it's not protection. It's insulation. It keeps out truth. It keeps out humility. And it blinds you to the dignity standing right next to you." His voice dropped even lower. "You've built walls out of menus, tuxedos, and gated invitations, but tonight I saw through them." The words hung in the room like fog. Then he said, "I didn't come here to teach a lesson." Pause. "But I hope you learned one." Keanu took a quiet step back from the edge of the spotlight, letting the silence breathe. The room, still frozen in its guilt and awe, remained motionless. Forks hovered above plates, hands gripped glasses without sipping. Every breath was held too long, every heartbeat louder than the music that had stopped playing long ago. He looked across the room once more, slower this time, taking in the faces that had once looked through him. Now they were seeing him, not the celebrity, not the myth, just the man. And they weren't ready for that. "I'm not angry," he said, "but I am disappointed." That sentence cut deeper than any accusation. Anger can be dismissed, but disappointment lingers. "I gave because I could," he continued. "Not because I wanted recognition, not because I needed to be thanked, but because I believe that true generosity doesn't ask for credit, it asks for change." He nodded slightly toward the front tables, where the wealthiest guests sat, some with eyes now lowered, others blinking away the weight of what they knew they couldn't undo. "We speak a lot about legacy," he said, "but legacy isn't measured by what you wear or what you own. It's measured by what you leave behind in others." A soft shuffle echoed in the back as someone stood quietly, a woman who had once laughed at him by the pool. She didn't speak. She just stood. No one else followed. Not yet. Keanu continued, his voice never rising. "I don't want applause. I don't want a standing ovation. I don't want any more attention than I've already received. What I want is for you to leave this ship different from how you boarded it." Another pause. "And that's not something you show me." His eyes scanned the room again. "That's something you'll show each other?" He gave a small, final nod, and then he stepped away from the microphone. He didn't wait for a reaction. He didn't look back to see if anyone clapped. He simply turned and walked off the stage, through the crowd, and toward the same doors he had entered through less than 10 minutes earlier. The room remained silent as he passed. Damian Cross sat still, his mouth slightly open, stunned. He looked around him as if searching for someone to laugh, to break the tension, to confirm that none of this mattered. But no one met his eyes. His hand trembled around the base of his wineglass. The guests looked to one another for cues on how to respond, but no one moved. No one stood. No one spoke. Because Keanu hadn't performed. He had revealed, and they had seen themselves in his reflection. He reached the doors and paused briefly, one hand resting on the handle. Without turning around, he let out a breath, quiet and long. Then he pushed the door open and disappeared into the darkened corridor beyond. The doors closed behind him with a soft click, and the ballroom, full of the world's most important people, sat in complete, echoing silence. The ballroom remained suspended in stillness long after Keanu had disappeared through the doors. The chandeliers flickered slightly above, but their sparkle now felt colder, almost sterile, as if the very light in the room had turned self-conscious. Guests sat motionless in their seats. Champagne flutes stood untouched. Plates of food grew cold. No one reached for their forks. No one resumed their laughter. The silence was not ceremonial. It was stunned. It was the sound of people realizing they had misjudged everything. A whisper broke out near the back. That really was him, wasn't it? Another followed. Keanu Reeves. Oh my God. Across the room, someone pulled out their phone and searched his name. Images loaded instantly. Red carpet photos, quotes, film clips, a list of charities, a video of him giving up his subway seat, another of him repairing a stranger's broken car. The truth unfolded before their eyes, and it hurt. More phones lit up. Each face that turned toward a screen paled as they scrolled. The man they had dismissed, ridiculed, laughed at, ignored, he had been someone all along. And not just someone famous, but someone good. Near the lounge bar, a young influencer stared at her phone, then quickly opened her camera roll. She began deleting stories. Stories she had taken of him walking alone, sitting on a bench, looking out over the sea. Captions like, "Luxury wildlife spotted," and "Who let this guy in?" vanished one by one. Another girl, seated 2 tables from where Keanu had stood moments earlier, pressed a napkin to her face. Her shoulders trembled. "I laughed at him," she whispered to the woman next to her. "I actually laughed." The woman touched her arm but said nothing. At the center table, Lawrence Carlyle remained frozen. The CEO hadn't spoken a word since Keanu had left the stage. Elise sat beside him, watching her father in silence. He stared at the empty space where Keanu had stood, his brow furrowed, lips parted slightly. It was the look of a man realizing his instincts had failed him, not in business, but in humanity. He finally leaned back in his chair, eyes unfocused, and muttered, "He gave more than all of us combined, and we gave him nothing." Elise reached for his hand under the table. "You can still do something," she whispered. In the far right corner, a group of crew members stood just inside the service entrance, half hidden by a curtain. One of them, a young man in a pressed white jacket, whispered to his colleague, "Told me," and went to Keanu Reeves. The other nodded slowly. "And we've been serving him food, like he's invisible." The young man looked down at the tray in his hands. "I don't think I'll forget this night for the rest of my life." Meanwhile, Damian Cross sat motionless at his table, one leg crossed tightly over the other, fingers drumming rapidly on the stem of his wine glass. His face had drained of color. His grin was long gone. He wasn't scrolling through his phone. He wasn't looking at anyone. He just sat there, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the tablecloth in front of him. Then a crew member in a black blazer approached slowly. In his hand, he held a folded slip of paper. The crew member stopped just beside Damian's table, his posture respectful but firm. "Mr. Cross," he said quietly. Damian looked up, startled. His fingers tightened on the stem of his glass. "This was left for you," the crew member said, offering the small, folded note. Damian took it with a stiff hand. He stared at it for a moment before slowly unfolding it. The handwriting was clean, simple, no flourish, just a few words written in soft, slanted strokes. "You taught me something I already knew. Some wear power like armor. You wore it like a mask. You chose the wrong one. Kekar?" Damian blinked. Once, then again. His fingers gripped the edges of the note like it might crumble. He read it again and again, but the words didn't change. He looked up as if expecting someone to explain what had just happened. No one met his eyes. One of the women who had been laughing beside him 2 nights earlier was now staring at her drink, not speaking. The man across from him scrolled slowly through an article titled, "Keanu Reeves quietly donates millions to children's hospitals." Damian folded the paper once, then again, then once more, until it was barely the size of a coin. He held it in his palm, motionless. A breath escaped from his lungs, shallow and uneven. No cameras had been rolling, no public press had captured the exchange. But he knew, deeply, bitterly, that this moment would follow him longer than any viral scandal. The gala never recovered. The orchestra resumed a slow instrumental, but it rang hollow. The dessert trays arrived, but few were touched. Conversations turned to whispers, then to silence, then to people excusing themselves from their tables. Some left without speaking to anyone. Others paused just long enough to look at the now empty stage. One by one, the ballroom emptied. Not from scheduling, not from boredom, but from a shared discomfort none of them had the words for. Out in the hall, murmurs picked up again. Made YouTube quarantined. And we laughed at him. He gave $2.5 million. And we let him eat alone? A woman cried silently near the corridor, wiping mascara from beneath her eyes, as her husband stood beside her, ashamed. Lawrence Carlyle and Elise were among the last to leave. He walked slowly, as though carrying something heavy that couldn't be put down. Elise looked up at him. "Will you reach out to him?" Lawrence nodded once. "If he lets me." Down below deck, in the quiet quarters near the stern of the ship, a light glowed beneath one cabin door. Inside, Keanu sat cross-legged on the small sofa, sipping tea, the sea whispering beyond the window. He had left behind no cameras, no headlines, no grand closing statement. Just a truth no one could ignore, and a silence none of them would ever forget. The suite was silent. The overhead lights had been dimmed, but the golden hues of the furnishings reflected the night in a hollow glow. Damian Cross sat hunched at the small table near the window, the carefully folded note laid out in front of him like a verdict. His jacket hung loose from his shoulders now, tie undone, white cuffs still buttoned, as if parts of the performance refused to surrender. The air inside felt heavier than it should have. He could still hear the echo of Keanu's voice in his mind, not the specific words. Those were already imprinted in the memory of everyone who had witnessed them, but the tone, the quiet, the gravity. Keanu hadn't pointed at anyone, he hadn't accused, he hadn't shouted, but the effect had been more precise than a knife. Damian leaned forward and carefully opened the note again. The paper was light, but it felt weighted in his hand. "You taught me something I already knew. Some wear power like armor. You wore it like a mask. You chose the wrong one," he said. He stared at the words, reading them over and over, as if repetition would dull the sting. It didn't. Each sentence peeled back a new layer. They were simple, direct, and devastating. He thought back to the gala, the cruel laughter, the wave of the hand, the command to security to remove the stray. It had felt like dominance at the time, a brilliant moment of public control. He had grinned, expecting the room to follow him, and for a few seconds, it had. But now that moment made his skin crawl. The note still trembled faintly in his hands. He tried to distract himself, moving toward the minibar. His reflection followed him across the glossy floor. He stopped when he saw it. The tuxedo looked pristine, elegant, expensive. But all he could see was a shell, a man whose value had lived in the shine of the fabric and the volume of his voice. He poured a drink, then stopped, staring at the liquid. He didn't want it, not tonight. He returned the glass, untouched. Damian sat again, this time by the balcony window. The glass was cool beneath his fingers. Outside, the sea stretched endlessly into darkness, moonlight casting a shimmering trail on the water. The sounds of the ship were faint behind him. Soft music, footsteps on upper decks, a door clicking shut somewhere down the corridor. And then he saw it. Far out on the black surface of the ocean, a small tenderboat drifted away from the yacht, its engine barely audible. It moved slowly, not hurried, not dramatic, just steady, focused. Inside it, Keanu sat alone near the stern, his silhouette framed by a soft overhead light from the pilot's console. No bags, no luggage, just his hoodie, his backpack, and the same quiet presence. He wasn't escaping. He was departing. With peace. Damian pressed his forehead against the window. It was cool against his skin. His breath fogged the glass slightly, and he wiped it away without thinking, eyes never leaving that small boat as it cut through the water like a soft punctuation mark at the end of an unfinished sentence. He had mocked that man, publicly, repeatedly. He had turned him into entertainment, into an object, into a lesson he believed he was above. And yet, it was Keanu who had walked into a storm of ridicule and walked out with grace still intact. It was Keanu who had given millions, who had helped the crew, who had sat with silence while being judged and never once retaliated. Not even once. The shame came in quiet waves, not in sobs, not in self-pity, just in the realization that the person he believed was beneath him had stood taller than anyone on that ship, and it had taken only a few handwritten lines to destroy the illusion he'd spent decades building. He picked up the note again, folded, unfolded, folded. He set it down. He stood, sat again. He ran his hands through his hair. There were no calls to make, no team to spin the story, no reporter to flatter. There wasn't a version of this moment he could control. That note hadn't been for the world. It had been for him. That made it worse. Somehow that made it sacred. He thought of the guests in the ballroom, their expressions, the influencer who had quickly deleted every mocking photo, the woman who had cried, the men who had gone silent, even Carlyle, who had once ruled boardrooms with icy logic, had been left speechless. And then he thought of the crew, the waiter Keanu helped, the staff who stood straighter just knowing who he was. They hadn't needed a spotlight to treat him with humanity. They hadn't needed confirmation of his worth. But Damian had, and now, even with the truth bare before him, he felt like the smallest man on the ship. His throat tightened, but he didn't cry. He couldn't. That would have required access to something he had buried long ago. Humility. What he felt now wasn't weakness. It was the end of pretending. He looked once more out at the ocean. The tender was further now, a speck of light in the dark. Still steady, still unbothered. Keanu didn't need to say anything more. The silence he left behind said everything. Damian stood again, turned toward the bed, and carefully placed the note on the nightstand. He didn't throw it away. He couldn't. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, palms pressed together, and stared at the floor. No more audience, no more stage, just a man finally realizing that the loudest thing in the world is truth. Down in the lower decks, away from the ballrooms and the glimmering crystal chandeliers, the mood was different. The echo of the captain's gala had faded. Dishes had been cleared, chairs realigned, yet something still lingered in the air. An energy the crew couldn't name but deeply felt. The narrow staff hallway was dim, humming with soft footsteps and the occasional creak of the ship against the waves. In the small kitchen reserved for crew breaks, 2 staff members stood near the coffee machine, their uniforms slightly wrinkled from the long shift. It was the same young waitress who had whispered her apology to Keanu on the second day. Her name was Lena, and her hands were still trembling slightly, not from fatigue, but from the memory of what she'd witnessed hours earlier. She turned to her coworker, a waiter named Julian, and said quietly, "He never even raised his voice." Julian glanced over, nodding slowly. And still, the whole room stopped breathing when he spoke. Neither of them had ever seen anything like it. Not in the months they'd worked these elite cruises, not among the celebrities who demanded attention or the billionaires who acted like royalty. Keanu hadn't asked for anything. He hadn't flexed his wealth. He hadn't even worn the right clothes. But somehow, his presence had landed harder than any speech made from the top deck. Lena leaned on the counter, still processing. "You remember the first night? When people laughed at him for standing by the hors d'oeuvres like he didn't belong?" Julian smirked. "How could I forget?" Damian told the security guard to escort the dishwasher back downstairs. "Like it was a game." She shook her head slowly. "He didn't say a word that night, just smiled. And tonight," Julian added, "he said everything, without ever naming names." The small galley kitchen was quiet for a beat. Outside, a soft knock of water against the hull reminded them the ship was still sailing, even as they stood there, frozen in thought. Lena spoke again, this time more softly. "It made me think." "About what?" "About how many times we've walked past people because of how they looked. How many times we judged someone's worth by their clothes, their title, the way they hold a glass." Julian didn't answer right away. He just nodded. Then he said, "You know what really got me? The way he helped me clean up the tray of broken glasses on day 3. Everyone else just laughed, even the guests who saw it happen." Lena remembered that moment too. Keanu had bent down without hesitation, picking up shards with the care of someone who'd done it before. Not once had he looked around to see who was watching. He had simply moved, quietly, respectfully. Julian walked over to the small whiteboard in the break room, where they usually wrote reminders about shift swaps and supply orders. Without saying a word, he picked up the dry erase marker and paused. Then he wrote, in neat capital letters across the top, "Dignity is a choice." Lena stared at the words. Her throat tightened. "That's what he showed us," Julian said, capping the marker. Lena nodded. "Not just the guests. Us too." Word spread quickly among the crew, not through official channels, not through announcements or memos, just whispers. Shared glances, quiet conversations in tucked-away corridors and back-of-house service stations. They spoke of the man in the hoodie, the one they had passed dozens of times with trays in hand, never fully registering who he was. And now, all at once, every moment with him had taken on new weight. In the laundry room, 2 stewards folded linens while speaking in hushed tones. "Did you see the look on the captain's face?" Hell didn't even know. No one did, except the man himself. On the back loading deck, a crew chef who had never once seen a guest clean up after themselves said to his assistant, "I watched him carry his own plate to the bin." Nobody else in that ballroom would have. Down in housekeeping, a veteran staffer who'd worked for 10 years without missing a shift whispered, "He reminded me what real respect looks like. He didn't talk down to anyone. He didn't expect anything." A printed itinerary from the gala was taped above the kitchen sink. Someone had drawn a quiet circle around the 8:00 p.m. anonymous sponsor recognition line. Below it, in fresh ink, a different hand had added the same phrase Julian wrote upstairs. "Dignity is a choice." It caught on fast. One of the cabin stewards added it to the inside of a locker door. A member of the kitchen prep team scribbled it on a post-it and tucked it behind the staff clock-in screen. Even the assistant cruise director, usually the most polished of the team, wrote it at the top of her notebook in careful cursive. And no one questioned it, because that one sentence summed up everything they had just seen. It wasn't just the guests who were reckoning with their behavior. The crew too felt something shift. Not guilt, but clarity. They realized they'd stood in the presence of someone who had been overlooked, underestimated, and ridiculed, and who had responded with unshakable kindness. Keanu hadn't made them feel small. He had made them feel seen. Later that night, after the last round of cleanup and the final silver tray had been returned to the galley, Lena passed by the whiteboard once more. The quote was still there. She smiled. Then, underneath, she added in smaller handwriting, "Thank you for noticing us." She didn't sign her name. She didn't have to, because every crew member who saw those words would know exactly who they were for. And far out at sea, sailing gently under stars that cared nothing for status or dress codes, a man with a hoodie and a quiet heart was already miles away, leaving behind a luxury cruise, forever altered not by scandal, but by the echo of humility, the kind that stays long after the spotlight fades. Morning came slowly aboard the Celestia. The sun rose in streaks of pale gold, casting light over the marble decks and shimmering softly on the sea's surface. The luxury yacht moved at a slower pace now, the final day of the voyage upon them. Staff moved quietly through the dining hall, preparing for the farewell breakfast, setting polished utensils beside folded linen napkins, and lining up carafes of fresh orange juice and dark French roast. Guests trickled in, some with sunglasses to cover tired eyes, others in crisp polo shirts and silk scarves, trying to resurrect a sense of control. But there was no laughter echoing off the walls this morning, no exuberant greetings. Even the clinking of cutlery sounded more cautious, more self-aware. At the center of the main dining room, a microphone had been placed discreetly beside the host's podium. A single sheet of paper lay on the stand, and behind it stood the ship's captain, dressed not in ceremonial blues but in a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled just past the elbows. He looked less like a symbol of command and more like a man who, too, had something to reflect on. He cleared his throat gently, and the room stilled. "Good morning," he said. "I'll keep this brief." Silence answered him. This voyage was, as always, curated with care. The entertainment, the meals, the destinations. But what none of us anticipated was the lesson we'd sail into. The reminder of something many of us have forgotten, or perhaps never knew. He looked around the room. This trip reminded us of who we pretend to be and who we truly are. Several guests lowered their eyes. He lifted the paper on the podium and unfolded it slowly. "I was given permission this morning to read a short message left behind by one of our guests. I believe, based on what you've already experienced, you'll know who it came from." He began reading. "To the guests aboard the Celestia, you've now returned to your names, your titles, your identities, but I hope you also return home with something else. The awareness that kindness doesn't come from comfort. It's revealed in discomfort. I didn't ask to be seen, but I saw you. And I hope, truly, that someday you will see yourselves. T.R." The words fell over the room like a soft snowfall, quiet but cold, heavy without weight. The type of message that didn't ask for applause, only reflection. A woman near the window let out a trembling breath. A man across the room reached for his glass with both hands, holding it to stop the shake. The captain folded the letter again and placed it on the podium. "Hal didn't leave a list of complaints or a request for attention," he said quietly. "Just a truth, one that I think many of us needed to hear." He stepped back. No one clapped. No one dared. They all sat with it, and one seat notably remained empty. Damian's chair sat untouched at table 1, directly across from the podium. It had been set like the others, perfectly aligned, freshly pressed napkin, a polished coffee spoon resting beside a pristine white saucer. But he never arrived. No one spoke of it. No one asked where he was. The guests around his table shifted slightly, trying not to look too long at the vacant seat. His absence was louder than a confession. And though his name was never mentioned, every person in that room knew exactly why it remained empty. Some tried to resume their meal. Forks lifted, then returned to plates without bites. The usual breakfast chatter, comparisons of flights, shopping plans, private car pickups, was nowhere to be found. Instead, people sat still, as if the note read aloud had quietly rewritten the atmosphere. At the back of the room, a younger guest scrolled through an article now going viral. A photo from the gala had surfaced. Keanu mid-step in the ballroom, hoodie visible, light catching just the corner of his calm, unshaken face. The headline read, "The man who gave millions and asked for nothing." Across the table, someone else read a different post, a transcript of Keanu's speech, already circulating online. Beneath it, thousands of comments. Words like grace, power, and humility filled the screen. Back in the dining hall, the captain had taken a seat near the exit, his plate untouched. He stared out through the glass wall toward the sea, now lit in soft hues of morning gold. Even he hadn't spoken much since stepping down from the podium. A server passed quietly between tables. No one looked up. Near the side buffet, the same young girl who had first recognized Keanu stood beside her mother. She tugged her sleeve and asked in a whisper, "Mom, why is everyone so quiet?" Her mother bent down and gently smoothed the child's hair. "Because we all realized something at the same time." The girl tilted her head. "What?" The mother looked toward the empty seat at Damian's table, then toward the folded letter still sitting on the podium. "The person we treated like a stranger," she said, "was the only one here who didn't need anything from us to be kind." The girl didn't fully understand, but she nodded anyway. And still, the quiet held. One by one, guests began to rise. Some took one last look at the ocean. Others paused near the podium, reading the letter once more, as if hoping to memorize its weight. No one photographed it. Not a single guest asked for a printed program. No one wanted a souvenir, because they were already leaving with something far more permanent. At the far end of the hall, the staff entrance door opened gently. A line of crew emerged to clear the tables. They moved with the same grace and rhythm they always had, but today, the room watched them differently. A man who once walked among them had revealed the truth with no anger, no spotlight, and no applause. And now, no one could forget it. Weeks passed. The luxury yacht Celestia returned to port, its marble floors polished anew for the next voyage, its chandeliers reset, linens replaced, and wine cellars restocked. But what lingered wasn't the scent of imported roses or the echoes of classical music from the ballroom. What lingered was the silence that followed Keanu Reeves's departure. That silence didn't stay on the ship. It traveled, it echoed, and then it erupted. The first clip appeared online 4 days after the voyage ended. A short video, just over 90 seconds, filmed shakily from behind a curtain by a crew member. The audio was imperfect, the angle slightly obscured, but the voice came through clearly. "I didn't come here to impress. I came to observe, and what I saw broke my heart." That single sentence exploded across the internet like a spark to dry timber. Within 24 hours, the video had amassed over 12 million views. By the third day, it was on every major platform, shared by celebrities, activists, teachers, and people who had never even watched a Keanu Reeves film. News anchors replayed the speech line by line, analyzing its tone, its intent, and its impact. Comment sections flooded. "This is what real power looks like." Alex didn't humiliate anyone. He revealed the truth. Most people would have lashed out. He walked out. Talk shows devoted full segments to it. Think pieces poured in from all corners of media. On class, on dignity, on humility, on how someone could possess so much and still choose to carry so little. One outlet titled their article, "The Speech Heard Around the World, and Why Keanu Said Nothing That Needed Defending." Another, "A Yacht, a Hoodie, and the Collapse of Modern Decency." But not everyone was applauding. On the same day the video reached its peak, another name began to trend. Nathan Hawthorne. The internet had uncovered Damian Cross's real name. It didn't take long. A few photos, a few old interviews, and the story unraveled quickly. Within hours, forums filled with his company affiliations, board memberships, and philanthropic claims. Videos of his previous speeches promoting empathy-driven capitalism resurfaced, and were torn apart. And then the headlines shifted. Nathan Hawthorne removed from 2 corporate boards following viral yacht controversy. Luxury investor faces backlash after mocking Keanu Reeves on charity voyage. Silenced by kindness, how one note undid a reputation. Nathan issued no public statement. His social media accounts went dark. A spokesperson offered a brief press release that said, "Mr. Hawthorne is taking time to reflect." But the world had already moved on. Toward Keanu. Clips of him helping the waiter made it online. Someone shared a photo of the now famous quote written on the crew whiteboard. "Dignity is a choice," and the internet embraced it. The quote began appearing on t-shirts, posters, mugs, and screensavers. But more importantly, it showed up in classrooms, in employee lounges, in shop windows. People weren't just repeating the words, they were rethinking their behavior. In Paris, a teacher wrote it on a chalkboard. In Cape Town, a train conductor posted it above the ticket booth. And in a small bookstore in Vancouver, the owner taped a handwritten note to the front glass. "Dignity is a choice." Okay. The bookstore was quiet that morning. The sign in the window, written in simple black ink on a piece of cream-colored paper, didn't advertise a sale or a new release. It didn't list hours or a website. It just said, "Dignity is a choice." Passers-by paused in front of the window. Some recognized the initials instantly. Others looked it up on their phones right there on the sidewalk. A few stepped inside, not to buy, but just to stand for a moment, to be part of something quieter than the noise they'd come from. A teenage boy bought a used copy of The Prophet by Khalil Gibran and asked if he could take a photo beside the sign. An elderly woman smiled and whispered, "He never needed to shout. He just showed up." The store owner, a soft-spoken man named Peter, watched it all unfold from behind the register, saying little, listening more. Across the world, the phrase began appearing in unexpected places. A surgeon in Tokyo wrote it above the break room sink. A bus driver in Detroit laminated it and taped it to the back of his seat. A CEO in Berlin quoted it during an all-hands meeting, her voice cracking slightly by the end. And on social media, it became more than a trend. People shared personal stories, moments they had judged someone unfairly, ignored a kindness, or remembered what it felt like to be unseen. They began talking not about Keanu's films or his fame, but about the stillness he carried into a room that tried to silence him, and how that stillness spoke more clearly than 1,000 speeches ever could. Podcasts explored the psychological weight of dignity. Universities discussed the ethics of power and the cost of public humiliation. High school teachers printed the story for their students, not as entertainment, but as curriculum. And still, Keanu remained silent. No interviews, no press tours, no social media posts. He said nothing because he had already said everything. Somewhere out of the spotlight, he continued his life as he always had. Quietly, simply, intentionally. And somewhere far from microphones, Nathan Hawthorne sat with the remnants of a reputation he had once thought untouchable. His companies didn't collapse. His name didn't disappear overnight. But the invitations grew fewer, the nods less certain, and perhaps most painful of all, people started looking at him the way he had once looked at others, with assumptions. In the mirror, the mask he'd worn so long now looked like what it always had been, fragile. One afternoon, Nathan walked past a bookstore while traveling under an alias in British Columbia. He paused outside and stared through the glass. The sign was there, "Dignity is a choice." Dicker said. He didn't go in. He didn't need to. He just stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, watching the words reflect in the glass between him and the truth. Behind him, people passed by without recognizing him. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight, not of being unseen, but of seeing too late. The harbor awoke gently, as if even the ocean knew that something sacred had passed through. The waves lapped softly against the wood pilings, their rhythm slow and measured. Gulls called out now and then, not in alarm, but in calm observation. There was no rush, no echoes of laughter from crowds, no paparazzi hiding behind posts, no rush of voices chasing someone famous. There was only light, stillness, and the steady sound of the tide rising into the morning. Keanu Reeves walked down the dock alone, his steps quiet, his presence as grounded as it had been the night he stepped onto that $100 million 0-cents yacht in silence. Nothing about him had changed. The same hoodie, the same jeans, the same well-worn sneakers. A canvas backpack hung over one shoulder, slightly faded at the seams, but dependable. Like him. The few locals around didn't recognize him, or maybe they did and simply respected the moment too much to interrupt it. A fisherman nodded politely as he passed, tipping his cap. Keanu nodded back. That was it. No drama, no flash, just the understanding between two men who had both seen the world from very different angles and knew how to respect this silence. As Keanu continued toward the end of the dock, a small scene caught his eye. A woman stood beside a cart of groceries near a bench, holding her phone between her shoulder and cheek while trying to balance several bags at once. One of the sacks had tipped over, spilling apples that now rolled across the dock. Her son, maybe 6 or 7 years old, scrambled to catch them. He crawled beneath the bench, trying to grab the last 2 apples before they slipped into the water. Keanu stopped a few feet away. He didn't speak. He knelt down beside the boy and reached gently beneath the slats of the bench. With calm fingers, he retrieved the final apple and handed it to the boy with a small smile. The boy looked up, bright-eyed. No fear, no hesitation, just pure recognition, not of the movie star, but of a kind man helping with no expectation. "Thanks," the boy whispered. Keanu nodded. "You've got good hands. You saved most of them." The boy beamed as he handed the apple to his mom, who had finally noticed who was crouching next to her son. She froze for a moment, eyes wide, phone lowering slowly from her ear. She didn't speak, her mouth opened slightly, then closed. But Keanu didn't wait for a response. He gave her a gentle nod and stood, brushing the back of his jeans lightly as he continued walking down the dock. She turned to her son. "Do you know who that was?" The boy shrugged. "Just a nice guy." She smiled, and the tightness in her shoulders softened. That was all it had to be. At the end of the dock, Keanu stopped. The sea stretched endlessly before him, a canvas of soft light and open space. He sat down at the edge, letting his feet dangle above the water, waves brushing just beneath the soles of his shoes. He didn't pull out a phone, he didn't take a photo, he didn't perform. He just watched the sea, the same way he had watched that room full of people in tuxedos and gowns. Quietly, with clarity, because sometimes you don't need to change the world. Sometimes you just need to be the one person in the room who doesn't look away. And that's exactly what he had done. On the ship, at the dock, in every room where he chose stillness over spectacle. Keanu sat there for a while, unmoving. The sky above him grew brighter as the sun rose higher, stretching rays of soft gold across the water's surface. The quiet filled in the spaces where applause used to live, where critics once speculated, where agents once called with urgency. But now, in this moment, there were no expectations. No scripts, no noise. Just the steady rhythm of the sea, the breeze tugging softly at his sleeves, and the comfort of being exactly who he was. There had been no ceremony when he left the Celestia. No final farewell, no red carpet rolled out on the deck. Only a small tender boat pulling away under starlight, his silhouette quiet at the stern, his thoughts his own. And yet, the silence he left behind had spoken louder than 1,000 closing speeches. It had reached farther than the ship's anchor ever had. In that silence, others began to see themselves more clearly. A crew member who once walked past guests without lifting her eyes now smiled as she passed strangers on her commute home. A tech executive who had built her identity on being unapproachable hugged her driver goodbye after years of working together. A girl in school who once judged a new student for wearing hand-me-down shoes now offered her seat beside him the next day. These were small changes, quiet ones, but Keanu knew better than anyone that quiet could change everything. He stood slowly, brushing his hands on his jeans, and turned from the sea. He began walking back along the dock just as the harbor started to wake with movement. Vendors opened their stands. A man swept the front of a bait shop. A family loaded up fishing gear into the back of their truck. He passed them all with a nod or a smile, but there was no need to say who he was. What mattered now wasn't recognition. What mattered was that someone had reminded the world of something we all forget: that dignity isn't awarded, it isn't reserved, it isn't dependent on suits or invitations or bank accounts. It's chosen moment by moment, word by word. And Keanu had chosen it again and again, even when he was mocked, especially then. He paused outside a small cafe near the harbor's edge. In its window, handwritten in chalk, were 5 words he hadn't expected to see. Dignity is a choice. He didn't smile in pride. He didn't take a picture. He simply stood there, reading it, letting the truth of it settle inside him once again. Then he walked on. And now, as we reflect on everything that happened, we leave you with this. True wealth isn't found in what you own. It isn't in how many people follow you, or what table you sit at, or what name is printed on your place card. True wealth is how you treat someone when you believe they have nothing to offer you. That's the measure. That's the legacy. And that's what lasts long after applause fades. So now we turn the question to you. Have you ever misjudged someone or been misjudged yourself? Have you ever seen a moment where quiet strength taught more than loud words? Comment below. We want to hear your story. And if this incredible story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. You never know whose world might shift because of it. Because sometimes the most powerful truths are carried not in thunder, but in silence.